Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Chairman, it's my pleasure to speak to Part 4 of this bill on the enforcement provisions. And these are worthy and necessary provisions that are set out, sir, in Subpart 1 on enforcement, Subpart 2 on remedial action, 3 on civil proceedings, 4 on enforceable undertakings, and then it goes on to talk about reviews and appeals. But, sir, all of this is the mechanical side of enforcement of health and safety in the workplace, and it relies, because of the changes in this bill, predominantly on the role of the inspectors. Now, I think I heard Sue Moroney say before we have 50 inspectors. 350 inspectors. That's covering the workforce across the entire countryside. So for Part 4 of this bill to work, you have to have the inspectors out there and being able, for example, to note a contravention so they can remedy it, or note a dangerous situation so they can issue a prohibition notice. But that will not work unless the people that work in the workplace itself are there and making sure from hour to hour, day to day and week to week that the conditions in the workplace are safe. And that's why this chance in a lifetime piece of legislation has been undermined and destroyed by the government, because they've taken away the fundamental role of the people that would otherwise enforce health and safety on the ground, sir. We know that health and safety representatives work. We've had them in the legislation before. This bill was going to bring those health and safety representatives to cover a much wider cross-section of the industry, and for reasons of bowing to the pressure from narrow, self-interested groups who are guilty of the contraventions of health and safety in the workplace, this legislation is not going to work. So Part 4, sir, very worthy, but it won't work, and it hasn't worked overseas. And what the international experience has been in Australia, in the United Kingdom and in other places, that health and safety legislation works when you've got good enforcement, you've got responsible employers, and you've got employees participating in the day-to-day safety of the workplace. It's 3 legs to a stool. This is one leg of the stool, but without that third leg, without the people that are working on health and safety in the workplace, and they are now excluded from the most dangerous parts of the workplace, that is the farms, the dairy farms and the cattle farms and the sheep farms, not the worm farms. The worm farms will have the ability to have health and safety people working on the ground, sir, but without those people on the ground, without them working in cooperation with the employees, without the ability of a union to come in and say this is not safe, and somebody will lose their life, somebody will be maimed for life. We've got one of the worst records in the world, sir. And it doesn't work if you're just relying on the mechanical provisions of this part. You have to have the active engagement of your workforce. And so I want to ask the Minister and the Chair, if he's following the proceedings, why it is that you are not backing up these provisions with the active participation of people on the ground. If it's good enough for Australia across the Tasman to do it, if it's good enough for the British to do it, if it's good enough in most other advanced Western countries to have a system that will actually work, why has the government gutted this piece of legislation? And I've been listening to this debate either in the chamber or in my room for the hours that it's been going on, and I have had no explanation from any minister in the chair as to why the government decided to gut the legislation. We supported this legislation as it was introduced. This legislation, as it was introduced, was a response to the Royal Commission following the Pike River disaster, sir. That was good legislation. It was legislation that followed the rulings, Mr. Chairman.
The Honourable Phil Goff.
It followed the rulings of the Independent Workplace Health and Safety Task Force. And I want to know from that minister that is sitting in the chair without comment why it is that you set up a task force, why you pay for a Royal Commission, why you pretend when there's a disaster like the Pike River disaster to be absolutely concerned, and you'll do everything possible so this never happens again, and 2 years out it's all forgotten. 2 years out, the meaningful changes that would have occurred in this legislation have been ripped out of the legislation, and we're left just with the mechanics of it, sir. I don't believe that the inspectorate by itself can do the job. I don't believe there's enough of them. I don't believe that they're given the support, and I don't believe that this legislation is going to make any meaningful change that was necessary when we saw a disaster of the proportions of Pike River. 29 people, sir, still entombed in the grave of that coal mine, and the country came together, and I was down there, the Prime Minister was down there, other MPs were down there, Damien O'Connor was working down there, and we came together and we said, this is appalling, this is a totally unnecessary loss of life, and we must do something to prevent it happening again. And this bill was born out of the task force, out of the Royal Commission, but the government wobbles at the knees when it comes back in, and a handful of small business people and farmers say, we can't have this, it's going to be awkward. Mr. Chairman, we must have this if human life is to have the sanctity that the House should be according it. And it doesn't matter how much we've got in this part of the bill in terms of prohibition orders and non-disturbance orders and inspectors, if we don't have the three parts of what is required to keep our people safe in the workforce, to make sure that when the men and the women in the workforce work there during the day, they are going to come home safe at night. I don't think it was too much to ask. In fact, I think you would have got a consensus of opinion across the floor of this House if this bill was doing the right thing. So yes, we'll speak in favour of the particular provisions in Part 4, but no, sir, we do not believe that that is sufficient or adequate actually to make a difference. And what everybody that has done research in this area has advised the House, what the task force advised the House, what the Royal Commission advised the House, this government has decided to withdraw from the bill. Now, I would like the Minister not to sit there silently, but I'd like him to take the next call to get up and say how these provisions will make a difference when the most important change that his own government introduced when they brought the bill to this House said should happen. And I'd also like to know, sir, that since we have gutted this bill because of private discussions between the national government and some of its supporters, why those discussions weren't taken back to the Select Committee and why there has not been justification for the changes that have been made. This is serious legislation. There is no topic more serious that this House considers than maintaining the health, the safety and the well-being of New Zealanders, men and women in the workforce, and yet we are reduced now to looking at a partial bill. I do want to speak, however, sir, in favour of SOP 101 in the name of N. Lees Galloway. We have found that the WorkSafe New Zealand often has not taken prosecutions, and when taken privately by the CTU, those prosecutions have succeeded. Private prosecutions are critically important, and there needs to be at least 6 months between a decision by WorkSafe not to prosecute and for individuals such as the Council of Trade Unions to put together a case to take to court, again to protect men and women in the workforce. 6 months is a reasonable period of time. I know Marama Fox has got an SOP that the government is looking to find a compromise of 3 months. It's not enough.
Galloway.